written, but I don't think I need it.
Oh. For 20 years, I
Test.
lectured as an adjunct, so 3 hours a night, once a week, 4 hours a class. I've never written anything else.
You're right.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for attending the Exploring Antarctica panel. We're very exciting. We have 5 amazing speakers here who have gone to Antarctica to create art, to conduct science, and to explore this continent. So today's event is a very special event. This is a discussion panel, so we're not going to be giving a series of talks. We're going to actually be interacting with you and answering your questions. And when we get to the question session, please feel free to ask a question of any particular individual panelist or to pitch something to the group as a whole. And so we'll start with brief introductions of each of our 5 participants. And we'll begin with Elise Engler.
Good afternoon. I was the recipient of the National Science Foundation Antarctica Artists and Writers Grant Program in 2009 and 2010. I was there during what's called the Austral Summer, which was from mid-December through mid-February. And while I was there, I was very fortunate because I was able to travel quite a bit, as well as spend long stretches of time in a number of field camps. So while I was in the Antarctic, I worked at McMurdo Station, which is the large central research station for the U.S. government. And then I was also at 2 penguin research camps, Camp Crozier and Cape Royds. And then I was also in the South Pole. So my proposal was entitled Unpacking Antarctica. And so the idea was to give people as much of a chance to get a sense of what actually does happen in the Antarctic, or what an artist sees. So it's sort of the science life filtered through an artist's eyes. So I was there working with penguin scientists, and I spent some time with geologists and also with people doing physics in the South Pole. And that's my work. And there's more work on the table over here, which I'd be happy to show people after the talk.
Must be me.
Yes.
So my name is Eric Lazo-Wasem, and I'm a senior collections manager for invertebrate zoology at the Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale University. Although I have had opportunities to collect all around the Western Hemisphere, certainly nothing has been as exciting as my 2 opportunities to collect specimens for our museum in the Antarctic. I went in 2009. I was a member of a party sponsored by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration to conduct fisheries surveys. And my role, because I know the non-fish organisms, the invertebrates, very well, I was asked to go along and help identify this material and evaluate it to be used as basically data gathering for further negotiations in fishing regulations in the Weddell Sea. In 2012, I was a member of a small group of Americans who were invited by the Avi Wegener Institute of Germany to go again to the Weddell Sea and conduct similar sorts of research. I was on the research vessel, the Polarstern, a huge vessel that had a swimming pool, 2 bars, and more space than is in the building practically that I work in at Yale. And that was a wonderful opportunity. Both of these provided a wonderful opportunity for me to collect material. We never had any Antarctic material at the Peabody Museum in its 160-year history. So now I've been able, in 2 expeditions, taking the view of a generalist rather than a specialist, which is the way most scientists approach Antarctic collecting. And I made a very large collection that is now going to be the fodder for future research for not only myself and my collaborators, but the next generation of scientists. Some of the specimens that I collected are mounted in the jars in the back of the room, and those are but a small example of the things that I've seen there.
My favorite.
Oh, yes. Yes, so on the left there is picture like that is currently on display in the National Museum of Chile. because it's one of the iconic crustaceans that are found. And then the other one is just one of my personal favorites because of its spiny look and beautiful coloration.
Beautiful, thank you.
So my name is Heather Lynch. I'm an assistant professor of ecology and evolution at Stony Brook University and co-PI of a big Antarctic monitoring program called the Antarctic Site Inventory. So our research aims to map the geographic distribution of penguins and seals and to understand the impact of climate change and tourism on Antarctic seabirds. And I have over something like 20 trips back and forth from Argentina to Antarctica, accumulated over 10 months of living and working in the Antarctic since 2006. And on the next slide, the work that we do is we had for 5 years an Antarctic field camp, so we were staying in tents in the Antarctic. Most of our work is actually in commercial cruise ships, some work on NSF research vessels, a lot of chartered yachts, and then finally increasingly doing a lot of this survey work by high-resolution commercial satellite imagery. So the focus of my own work is on these 3 species. They're all in the same genus, the genus Pygacellus, or the brush-tailed penguins. And that's the group of penguins that I've spent most of my career studying.
Hi, I'm Margaret Rubega. I'm an associate professor of ecology and evolution at the University of Connecticut, and I happen to be your Connecticut state ornithologist. How many people didn't know they had a Connecticut state ornithologist? Yeah, wow. Fewer than I would have imagined. I probably hold the record here for a person who went to Antarctica longest ago. I was in the Antarctic to do ornithological research in the austral summer of 1988-89. And I was at a field station called Palmer Station, which was on the Antarctic Peninsula. I put up a map here so that you could get an idea of where we're talking about. That's a map of all of Antarctica. And if you look at the red dots, the red named places name field stations. Palmer Station is way over there on that little spit of land that sort of sticks up into the Southern Ocean. And another look at it over here shows that it's way closer to South America than most people imagine. And Palmer Station and the area around it is, if you take one of these classic tourist cruises to Antarctica, most likely you're going to fly to Argentina or Chile, get on a boat, and head to this part of the Antarctic. Old Antarctic hands referred to this as the banana belt of the Antarctic because occasionally the temperature gets above freezing. That was Palmer Station. I was working on, I am probably also hold the record for being the only biologist who studies birds in the Antarctic who you're going to meet who didn't work on penguins. Ever. That's a South Polar skua, and that's a South Polar skua chick and egg. And the reason that we were there studying them is kind of evident in the picture. When you think about bird nests, you tend to imagine a structure, right? And that's pretty much all you get if you're a South Polar skua chick is a dirt spot on the ground, a little ice-free dirt spot. And we were studying these birds because by human standards, they're really lousy parents. They really give their kids an astonishingly small amount of care, starting from very, very early on. So we were interested in how that could be possible, how chicks could grow and thrive in the sort of temperatures that you get in the Antarctic under those conditions. And that research actually got sidelined while I was there. If you want to turn the next picture over, Dan. By that ship, way up there in the picture, that is an Argentine transport vessel called the Bahia Paraiso. And while I was in the Antarctic, that ship, by going out of Palmer Bay by a route that it had been warned against multiple times previously, ran onto a spire, dragged a giant hole in their hull, and created the very first oil spill in the Antarctic. That's a life raft coming into Palmer Station. Palmer Station is set up to host on the order of about 50 scientists, researchers, and support people, and overnight we gained an additional 260 people who had nothing but the wet clothes on their back. That plus the oil spill that resulted when the ship sank, which it did, really altered the course of our research from there on out. It ended up destroying our whole study population, but not in the way that we expected at the front end when the oil was actually in the water. So it's an interesting and not very happy tale, but it has, that particular event has sort of organized a lot of what actually goes on. If you get on a cruise ship and go to Antarctica now, many of the procedures they put you through have to do with this particular event.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm repeating something that was just said. I'm also an artist. Oops. An artist, and I received a National Science Foundation Artists and Writers Grant for 2012, where I spent 6 weeks living in McMurdo Station, which is the National Science Research Foundation's research center for scientists. And I spent it a little earlier in the springtime, because the light is a little bit different in the spring than it is in their summer. It's also quite cold. And being there for 6 weeks and being the only artist there having the grant, I was surrounded by scientists and able to actually learn what all the scientists were doing. You basically are in a dormitory situation, and you have your breakfast, lunch, and dinner in a cafeteria, and you bring your tray in and sit down. So I was able to sit down with all the scientists and learn what they were doing. And went and visited the penguins, went to see the seals, went to the South Pole. I was able really to travel all over the Ross Dependency and be able to photograph places in the world that most people would never see. I was really interested in the light that was in Antarctica, because my photographs basically are about light, and my project was the hidden light. So when we look around us, we see visible light. That's what our human eyes can see. But the spectrum is much larger than that. And I was always curious to see what the landscape would look like in the infrared spectrum and in the ultraviolet spectrum. So because of that, going to places in the world where there was a lot of ultraviolet light brought me to Antarctica, because there is a tremendous amount of ozone depletion that happens there. There's a lot of ultraviolet light, and I would be able to capture a lot of ultraviolet light on the landscape. On the other end of the spectrum, the infrared light waves also are quite long and intense, because the sun during the austral spring and summer is very low on the horizon, and the light waves are very long. So in both situations, I would be able to capture that light. However, by being there, I also learned that Antarctica was much more than light, that the elements, the harsh elements of Antarctica really shaped its landscape. So in this photograph, it's called Ultraviolet Reflections, you are basically looking at something called a pressure ridge, which is when the ocean collides and actually forms a ridge into the ice. So if you were looking at it with your own eyes, it would just look like a white ridge. But because the sun is very low and it's hitting these snow crystals that are on the ice, each little crystal acts as a prism and breaks down the light into ultraviolet light. Next, yes. This is a good example of infrared light waves. So this is basically Lake Vanda, which is a lake in the dry valleys of Antarctica. Antarctica has a big desert where there is no snow, and there are lakes strewn throughout the dry valleys. And this is Lake Vanda. And what happens is infrared light waves, basically, this is black and white infrared film, which isn't made anymore. It's expired, and I'm using my expired film. It's film, and anything that is warmer appears white, and anything darker is colder. So this is basically the different gases that have been trapped in this ancient lake, and the reactivity it has to the infrared light waves. So the gases all have different temperatures that they're recording, and so you get this very surreal photograph. But if you look at the ice, it's just ice with maybe some little dots in it, so you would never see this with your own eyes. Next. And this is Greenwood Valley, and basically it's showing you what the wind does to our landscape, so Antarctica's landscape. So the wind is very, very powerful. Its average is at 67 miles an hour, and they have different types of winds. They have a circumpolar wind, which goes around the pole, and katabatic winds, which kind of go from high to low. And the combination of the winds is extremely intense and causes tremendous amount of differences in the landscape. So here we're just looking at the effects of the wind on the ice and how it creates this amazing pattern.
And for those of you who have not met me, I'm Daniel Ksepka. I'm the curator of science here, but I exist only to moderate this event, and so please do not direct any questions my way. I do study extinct penguins, but ironically not from Antarctica. And so we'll open up the floor to questions now. Cynthia will come to you with a microphone, so if you'll please raise your hand, we'll work the crowd, and please speak into the mic. And again, please feel free to direct a question to one of us or to the panel as a whole if it's a general question.
Have to make sure there too. Thank you. Well, thanks all for being here. I have a question that doesn't probably affect any of you, but maybe you have some knowledge of it. What are the territorial disputes that go on between nations who feel they own pieces of the continent? Are you familiar with any of that?
Nobody owns it. People have countries have access to different areas, but nobody. It's not owned. There's the Antarctic Treaty, I think, is ratified in 1959 and was re-ratified fairly recently. So it's not about ownership. It's a very idealistic kind of treaty because it does stop people from, for example, looking for oil or mining rights or military use. So at this point, there's a kind of as I say, idealistic and hopeful attitude. Maybe it's the only continent that isn't subject to that kind of commercial or military rivalry.
I'll just jump in to say that in principle, that's absolutely true. I would say perhaps on the Antarctic Peninsula, where my own experience is, the countries are very crowded together in terms of what they consider to be their historical territorial claims. And even just in my own work this season, we were trying to survey near an Argentinian base, and we were told that the Argentinians owned this, which of course they do not, and we were told that we needed to be accompanied everywhere that we went. And so our scientists were followed around by the Argentinians for something like a 3-hour penguin survey, which is not untypical. So there's also a very subtle territoriality we have on occasions when the Argentinians or the Chileans or a base does not want us surveying in their areas. We've been invited in for 3 hours of mate, which is hard to refuse, but it's very effective because by the time that they decide that the mate is done, our ship is ready to pick us up and leave. And they have effectively stymied our efforts to do survey work in their area. So it's interesting. It happens not explicitly, but sometimes quite implicitly.
So is it reciprocal? Do the Americans also try and keep the Argentinians out?
I can maybe add something that puts some of that into context. It's worth knowing that the treaty that Elise referred to is operational, and every country that has signed on to it, what they actually signed was a statement that says they agree not to press their territorial claims, but the treaty makes explicit that no one is sacrificing their territorial claims. So at any point, a country could decide that they're going to break the treaty and press their territorial claims because no one has formally abandoned their territorial claims. And there are a lot of potentially valuable minerals and other resources in these areas, so it's not inaccurate to say that some of the countries who have research stations in the Antarctic are maintaining them not so much because of their interest in the research, but because it maintains their territorial claim to have bodies in the Antarctic.
Question?
Are there any polar bears?
No. No polar bears. There's really only penguins and seals and birds.
So you mentioned that polar bears are in
Polar bears live in the Arctic.
the north.
But that
In
was
north.
that was a
north.
super smart question to ask because
But a
lots
lot of
of
people
are
ask that.
confused about that.
Exactly.
I'm a photographer, and I would be very much interested in what kind of camera system do you use, what kind of lenses do you use in the Arctic, because it's a totally different environment, and whether you use any specific filters. Well, I may have some other question.
Okay. Well, the infrared film that I use is in a Leica camera. And with infrared film, you have to use a red filter in order to filter out visible light in order to enhance the infrared film. I have to say that this Kodak high-speed infrared film was the best thing that was invented, and fortunately doesn't exist anymore. And no other infrared film was as good. It had a thicker emulsion on the film so that there would be more layers for the light to go through. The color, my color work is done with digital because I can change the white balance on the digital camera, where I can create it according to the temperature that I'm photographing rather than automatic, because digital camera is just trying to recreate what's supposed to be visible, and I really want to enhance the ultraviolet colors. So I basically do a white balance according to the temperature, and I kind of figure that out. That is a Nikon. I use a D3X or an 800. Then there's another camera that I'm using that they don't make anymore. It's a Fuji camera. It's a Fuji IR UV camera. And that camera allows for UV and ultraviolet light to come in because the lenses are not filtering the UV light the way they do now. So in the beginning, when digital cameras first came out, all the pictures had blue shadows. They were allowing a lot of ultraviolet light to come in, and people didn't like that. And they've been developing cameras to get rid of UV light. So this is an old camera that was specifically made for UV IR photography. But the problem is it's only a 12 megapixel camera. So you have to sort of give up something in order to get something.
Other questions, how long do your batteries last? Because in the cold...
Believe it or not, okay, I expected it was going to be freezing, all my batteries would be dead. I am so long on batteries. They lasted very well. Yeah, they were fine. And I could just charge them again. The only ones that didn't last were the ones for the film camera, because they're just the little, what do they call them? The little button ones. And we had made a mistake. This was really bad. I had an assistant with me, and she had probably left them out in the cold, even though she said she hadn't, and none of them worked. And it was the beginning of the trip, and I didn't have any batteries, and I'm in Antarctica, and there's no store to buy these batteries. So working with the New Zealand government, I got batteries. I had to sort of sneak them in because they don't allow you to bring batteries into the country. You're supposed to have them inspected because there's lithium in them and you're not supposed to put any lithium there. So I had to smuggle them in, but I got them in.
I could tell just a little story about batteries that was really shocking to me. So the pictures of the crustaceans you saw with my slides are made with a special camera setup I have that uses a very nice flash system that is synchronized with the camera, and it's all tethered through my computer. So I took, typically on each trip, I took around 3,000 photos of invertebrates. And on my first trip, I had just bought the camera system, and the only thing I neglected to buy was batteries. And I realized this as I was sitting I was in the air flying from Miami to Santiago, and I realized I should have bought those batteries while I was in Miami, but this shouldn't be a problem, really. It's not that specialized of a battery. I was in Santiago, and I went to the gift shop, and I found 4 packs of these batteries, and I said, well, I better buy these. So I quickly buy them. And I went back, and as I was sitting in my chair, I started looking at what I'd paid for these batteries, and I was like, gee, this sounds like, how much is such and such money converted? And I found out I had just dropped like $130 on a few batteries. And my assistant back at Yale is actually she saw this charge, is like, what is he doing buying these batteries down there? However, I did find, after the trip was done and I was back in Punta Arenas, Chile, where the boat was stationed, I walked several days to walk the city. I never once saw the batteries that I needed. Had I not bought them in Santiago, I would be dry about 3,000 pictures right now. So that's something to remember, is to bring batteries.
Hi, we're planning on taking a trip to Antarctica this year, and our first thought was go when it's warmest. But then I'm realizing by listening to you that there may be a lot of things that we might miss by going at that time, like the ultraviolet light will be better. And I'm wondering what else might be going on at other times when it's not as warm, like penguin action and things like that.
Well, I'll speak to that because we work off the commercial cruise ships, and so our field season is November through March, and we know all the companies very well. It is sort of a changing landscape. Certainly the peak of the season, December, January, you're getting penguin nesting. Getting into February, you get penguin chicks. But there are some late trips in March. There's an Antarctic marathon that runs in March. There are marine mammal cruises that run in March. So by the time you get to March, it's just good to know that you're not going to see a lot of nesting birds. You're mostly going to be seeing marine mammals and a lot of whales. It may be a bit warmer, but it's definitely a different kind of experience. But it's never that warm, so that's worth keeping that in mind.
What has been the impact of global warming on Antarctica, and what do you foresee in the future?
I can speak a little about that. My photographs really have a lot to do with global warming because I've been studying a lot about ozone depletion. I'm pretty knowledgeable about the amount of ultraviolet light that has to come through the ozone depletion in order to be able to create ultraviolet light. And Antarctica, most of the research scientists, I have to say, that were there when I was there, were really concerned with global warming and the effects of the rising temperature in the ocean, what was going to happen to the fish and all of the animals were there, the penguins, the seals. They were very concerned. But one of the things that's interesting is that people are saying, well, the ice has been expanding around Antarctica, so there couldn't be global warming. But that's exactly why they know that there is global warming, because the glaciers that are in Antarctica are fresh water. And because they've been melting, they melt from the bottom up because the ocean is much warmer than it is in the air. And so because they've been melting, they've literally added ice to the area around Antarctica. So the ice around Antarctica has gotten much larger, and that's why they know that there is definitely global warming in Antarctica. And the other thing that they know is, you know, we've been measuring carbon dioxide levels throughout the Earth. And when I was at the South Pole, they have an atmospheric research center. They have 3 centers. One is atmospheric research. And they literally have the carbon dioxide level in the last 10 years mapped through all over the world, including the South Pole. And even in the South Pole, the carbon dioxide level has gone up in the same proportion as everywhere else. So, and there is no pollution. It's the clearest air there is. So the carbon dioxide level is global. It doesn't stop because it's in China or the United States or Antarctica. So it is something that's happening.
Just to give you some, maybe kind of a visual reference, Dan, can you back up to that picture of Palmer that I had? There you go. So I'm just going to try and talk really loud. When you look at this picture, all of this you can see from over in that corner. That's glacier, right? So that the station is on it's actually an island that has been connected to the mainland by this glacier for a very long time. This picture was taken in the austral summer of 1988-89, and you can see where the glacier comes to. This glacier has now retreated all the way to the top of this ridge.
Right.
It's miles away. The front edge of this glacier is now miles away from where it was when I was at this field station. So if you look at the thickness of the glacier there and think about how much water that actually represents, that gives you sort of a rough approximation of what it is that scientists are talking about when they say, as global change, as this climate change melts glaciers all over the world, sea level has to rise. There isn't really anywhere for the water to go in the ocean except up.
I have a question about photography. I wondered what we were actually looking at with the picture that was on the screen before and the first one that was shown. Is that a close-up of something very small? Is it a large area? Here. Yeah, for example. Are we looking at a whole panorama? Are you above it, photographing it at that angle?
That's the question I get from everyone. What is the size? Are we looking at something small? Are we looking at something large? And that's really what my photography is about, because I really think micro and macro are about the same. So I want to confuse you a little bit. I'm glad you're confused. But no, this is I'm actually standing on the ice and just photographing a pressure ridge. It's right in front of me. And what happened was I saw this like blue light kind of coming out through a hole. And I was really fascinated with that blue. So I really wanted to focus, and I think that's what's in here. And I just thought, well, I'm going to get this beautiful white with this sort of blue hole coming through. But when I went back and looked at it on my computer, this is what I got. So I haven't done any alteration to anything. There's no filters, there's nothing. It's just what the ultraviolet light did. One of the things that I researched also after I got this photograph, and I was with a team of scientists that were actually kind of talking about ozone depletion, but more in the troposphere, in our own atmosphere. And one of the scientists, they were measuring it from bromines. So the salt water has a lot of bromine in it, and there's a tremendous amount of bromines in the Antarctic Ocean. And so the bromines come up onto the snow that's on the sea ice, because it's salt water, and then they evaporate into the air, and they cause a chemical reaction which does something with ozone. So there were all these scientists. There was one measuring the bromines on the snow. There was another scientist measuring the proportion of gases in the air, and another one measuring the ozone depletion. There were 3 levels of scientists. And I was really curious, because this is one body of work, but I've taken a lot of photographs in the Arctic and even in the Great Salt Lake. And every time I'm taking pictures of anything that has to do with salts or sulfur, the ultraviolet light is really intense. So I did research, and I found out that bromines are actually very fluorescent, and that there are physicists that actually have bromines in tubes, and they shoot ultraviolet light in, and it fluoresces. So I thought that's really amazing, because these little ice crystals have bromine on them. So there's a combination of things that are happening here, which was pretty fascinating to me.
All right. I have a question. We had three people who studied three different kinds of animals: crustaceans, birds, and penguins. One probably naive question: are they in the same area, and how do they interact with each other? I know it's as big as like the United States, but are they in the same area? How do they interact, and what do they eat?
Well, that's a good question. Each other, I guess, if we were to cross all three groups. One of the main predators of penguins, certainly when they're breeding, their eggs and their chicks are skuas. And they are, in fact, it's both gruesome and fascinating to watch that play out. And then penguins, their main, what penguins eat is mostly fish and Antarctic krill. So it's a very small food web in the Antarctic, and it makes it quite tractable for science. And then as for details about the skuas, I'll pass it further down. But largely geographically speaking, they all do live in the same areas. And in fact, I don't know. In fact, I'll ask a question for the next panelist as to whether or not there are skuas breeding where penguins aren't.
That's a good question. And I believe that the answer to that is no. Skuas do largely specialize in taking penguin chicks and eggs in order to feed themselves and to feed their offspring. So in general, you're not going to find skuas in places where there aren't penguins to prey on. There are some other birds, petrels, some species of gulls that nest in places that are even farther inland than you're likely to find penguin colonies. But they are largely birds who commute to the coast and eat invertebrates, eat these little shrimp-like critters called krill. And I'm going to let Eric talk about that.
Yeah, well, so the most of the invertebrates that I have studied, and most of the invertebrates you're going to find associated with Antarctica are going to be aquatic organisms living basically benthically or in the midwater region. Birds, such as diving birds, can go down and feed on these because some of these crustaceans are quite large. I'm talking something maybe 3 or 4 inches long. Krill, of course, are the sort of, that's the sort of pivotal crustacean that you think about when you think of Antarctic crustaceans and their relative importance to whales and things, so people have often heard of krill. But when we're talking about the invertebrates, the diversity is in the Antarctic is thousands of different species, and they are all interacting. Basically, if you're bigger, you can usually eat something smaller than you, and it just works its way all the way up to the point where there is a complete interconnected web associated with the bottom structure, the things that are living on the bottom that produce habitat for smaller things, and they all just interact. But in terms of actually what every individual species feeds on, most of it's actually not even known when you're talking invertebrates. Many species of invertebrates from the Antarctic are known only from the sense that we can say, I can identify it and say it's this, but what do I know about its biology? Nothing, because that level of study hasn't been done for the diversity that we're talking about with regards to Antarctic invertebrates.
Eric, I want to thank you for lending us some of your specimens.
Oh, you're welcome.
They've had a lot of attention to them. So as I understand it, you've started de novo the Yale Peabody invertebrate,
especially the Antarctic material. Yes.
Right. Yeah. In the fossil collection, what do you have that you could study and make comparisons? It's a very different environment 250, 300 million years ago. And I'm just wondering, in terms of, from an evolutionary perspective, any links you've been able to?
Well, you can always look at the invertebrate fossils, and keep in mind, we actually have a separate, distinct invertebrate fossil collection, and those fossil people are, they work on that material. I don't do much in the way of fossils. However, certainly for recreating the history of the sort of Antarctic climate is going to be reflected in the types of invertebrate fossils you find. You'll keep in mind there's this very, Antarctica is considered to be very ancient. It's been isolated for a long period of time, and certainly that's going to be reflected in the fossil record, which is then slowly, as we move closer towards modern times, and actually we're going to see all sorts of distributional changes with organisms that on a global scale may have been dominating, that are no longer nearly as important as they are now. So it's all sort of, being a recent invertebrate person, I really pretty much look at a two-dimensional structure, looking back at the data not much more than 150 years. When you start dealing with the fossil, you start looking at you're really looking at many dimensions, and depending on how far back you want to go. So it's, in any fossil record, you're going to see considerable changes in most of the component organisms. Some things, however, will be fairly stable. So that's why we have various organisms which we refer to as living fossils, whereby they've just been around kind of everywhere for long periods of time.
This may be a question for a travel agent, but are there some tours that are more scientifically oriented than others?
I'll take that one. We work with a company called One Ocean Expeditions, and so certainly on all the trips by One Ocean Expeditions, the Antarctic Site Inventory will be on board, so we have 2 to 3 biologists on all of their cruises. Certainly some of the other companies, like National Geographic Lindblad, they have killer whale biologists on board. We've worked with them for nearly a decade ourselves. So yes, and that's something, to definitely ask the companies about. But a lot of these companies do host scientific programs because they do offer quite a bit in the way of access.
Thank you. I have a few questions. The crustaceans that you've brought, these marvelous species, do you also study if there are fish in that general area? Do you do studies of that also? And are there international boundaries where they're not allowed to come close to a certain, I'm sure they have radar or whatever they use, computers, to make sure they're not coming closer than they should be to do the fishing? And the other question is, are all of these marvelous discoveries and information that you've gathered, is that privy to all other scientists of other countries?
Well, that's okay. That's something I think I can address. A couple of things there. Certainly, the area, in terms of area where I was studying in the Weddell Sea, much of it has been closed to commercial fishing by international treaty for many years. Part of the data gathering we are doing was looking for the most at-risk invertebrate habitat, the type of habitat which, through a superstructured network of community, they provide an area that a lot of other invertebrates will live, thereby also attracting fish. So they're all sort of interrelated. When we found areas that had certain indicator species, one of which is in the back of in one of those cabinets, there's a beautiful lace coral. Lace corals are these big sort of convoluted superstructures of calcium carbonate. Many organisms live in association with that, and those particular lace corals are considered so fragile that if you drag a net through them, it will wipe out the community. So actually, as a result of the 2012 survey, we actually listed several species that we recommended as being exclusion zones for fishing, and I believe that they have been accepted. So the data are actually used in determining where people can fish legally. Of course, there's a lot of illegal fishing going on. In terms of the scientific data, much of the data is actually just on deposit in archives of the various national government agencies involved in the fisheries research. It's available to anyone, although sometimes it's mind-bogglingly difficult to get a hold of it. However, being the collection that I've collected, everything that we've collected and recorded has actually been cataloged in a database, and every 24 hours that database gets updated, and all those data are sitting there on the web right now, including those pictures that you see here. You can go to our Peabody website, and I have right now about 400 or 500 images of Antarctic invertebrates that I've taken of this sort of level of detail, and those are available for anyone to look at and anyone to use. So that's why I felt it was important. It was a great opportunity for me as a museum person, because it's mainly only museums that really put together real large data sets like this and just make them completely easily accessible to the general public.
I just wanted to add that Dr. David Ainley, who's a penguin scientist who works a great deal in Cape Royds and Cape Crozier on the New Zealand side of Antarctica, has worked with a number of other people to make a film. It's called The Last Ocean, and it's also a part of a campaign for people to understand the overfishing of the Antarctic Sea. And when you think you're eating Chilean sea bass, very often you're in fact eating something called, it's really got many names, like the Antarctic sea bass and the Antarctic char, and he's been trying to work with people to try and get people to stop eating that fish. So it's worth looking. If you go online and you go to The Last Ocean, you'll see you'll have access to that film or a way to see that film, and it talks a lot about the overfishing in that region.
In addition to that, I just want to tell you that you can find an excellent list of things not to eat on the Monterey Bay Aquarium website, which offers a little pamphlet you can even bring to the store. To the woman who is on the left, I'm sorry, I cannot remember your name. I am so jealous that you were standing on a pole. I think that's fantastic. That is a life dream of, I think, a lot of people to be able to do that. The other ladies, the ornithologist and the penguin people, I think anybody who is helping birds is a fantastic person, and I want to congratulate you on that work. Keep it up, especially in Connecticut, okay? Because we have a lot of great stuff here, we really do.
I have so few other virtues, that's really encouraging.
Well, that one makes up for all the others, I think. The woman who's a photographer, Ms. Tuft, I believe her name is, I have to congratulate you on one thing which I think is very interesting about photography, and that is that you can look at a picture like this, which is a very realistic depiction of something. You can see that in some of the beautiful paintings in the Dutch thing here. And you can also see that photography can be used so abstractly as to create all kinds of things in your mind, patterns that you're showing in nature, patterns. And I really appreciate that. I love your work for that. I do want to say one last thing, though, to the gentleman who collected these fine specimens that I have never seen before, so beautifully displayed. Do you need anybody to go with you on your next trip? Because
that is a question many people have asked.
I have a very good eye. I'm a combination artist-scientist, and I'd love to go. And the reason for that is the last thing I want to say is I just want to know if anybody knows if there is a memorial or some kind of a statue on Palmer Peninsula regarding my great-great-great-granduncle, many greats, who goes back, Nathaniel B. Palmer, who trolled the waters of Antarctica as a person looking for pelts, and then he discovered Antarctica, and his home was in Stonington, Connecticut, right at the other end of the line from near Rhode Island. Is there any kind of a thing down there that gives credit to people for all the wonderful things that science and other scientists have done over time?
Well, I can't speak to Palmer in particular, although the Antarctic is rife with memorials, and you think you're in this a blank wilderness that few people have ever stepped on, and you turn the corner and there's a cairn and there's a marker, there's a cross. And that's one of the most amazing things I think about visiting the Antarctic is not just the wildlife, but really the history and the history of exploration and bravery and science that has come before, the relatively easy, comfortable life that we have now in the Antarctic.
Certainly, one thing I could think there. First of all, in Punta Arenas in Chile, there was some sort of a monument, memorial outside exhibit for the whaling industry and the early people that were the early settlers in Punta Arenas who had been involved in the development of the whaling industry. But also, you'll see it in the geographic names that you see on the Antarctic continent. So the one that I can think of specifically, an amazing achievement, is Wilkes Land. Wilkes Land is named for the leader of the exploring expedition, the United States exploring expedition in 1838 to 1842, which is actually credited with the discovery of the Antarctic continent as having continental proportions. He surveyed about 1,000 miles of the coast, which is an amazing achievement in the basically it was 1839, 1840 he was there. He was in a vessel of about only 160 feet long, three-masted ship. Now that's pretty tough, but one of the boats that accompanied him was a New York pilot boat, which was basically an open schooner that was only 70 feet long and had a beam of about 20 feet. And that actually went down. They surveyed 1,000 miles of the coast in very difficult conditions. But we see that now attributed to them by the geographic names, Wilkes Land and other lands and named geographic features.
For what it's worth, the Olive Palmer Station, of course, is a memorial to your great uncle. But
not so much concerned about that, but only to know that Antarctica was really the seventh continent on the world, and it was never discovered, and nobody knew about it until the 1800s.
Right.
Is kind of an amazing feat there. And Mr. Wilkes, of course, obviously was the person who figured out that it was a continent, not just an island somewhere that Palmer and his other English cohort at the time didn't really know.
It might or might not gratify you to know that at the time in the 80s, the late 80s, when I was at Palmer Station, there was a bar. There's a bar at every Antarctic station.
At least one.
At least one. And it was a fairly common practice at the beginning of an evening, let's put it that way, for whoever was starting a round to start a round of "To Captain Palmer." I don't know if they still do that or not.
To what extent has the natural resource and the mineral wealth of the continent been determined? Has it been explored thoroughly? Is there anything unusual found? Are there any commercial attempts to drill for oil or to do other explorations of that nature?
Well, most of the commercial exploitation has been, I believe, has been due with commercial fishing that has gone on in the waters. So the waters itself, the diversity and richness is so valuable. Certainly, think of the potential for basically mining, as it were, the krill population, which occurs in the Southern Ocean. Krill, which is used in fish pastes and for krill oil. It's not eaten directly because it has a very unpalatable flavor, but the potential for harvesting that is huge. The stocks are estimated up to 750 million metric tons, which add 20%, you got our U.S. short ton, and yet only about 180,000 metric tons were taken in 2012. So it's a huge potential for exploitation, and that's why so much science is going on there evaluating the fish stocks and seeing just how much is at stake here and how much can we actually open up.
Who
I'm sure
controls
mineral
the
rights
area?
are big too, because there's many vessels operating there doing mineral surveys.
Well, it's interesting if you look at the original Antarctic Treaty when it was originally signed, it was very much focused on mineral exploitation and nuclear weapons testing, which had been going on in Antarctic waters. And in fact, the Antarctic environment was not even mentioned at all in the original language. And in fact, the Antarctic environment and the animals that we think of now as being so important to the Antarctic were not protected until the 1991 Protocol for Environmental Protection. So it was very late in Antarctic history that we even came to recognize the value of the animals and the plants and the environment itself. It was very much focused on minerals and nuclear weapons testing. And now, of course, the Antarctic environment and the protection of the animals is very much central to the Antarctic Treaty, process every year.
Has anyone found oil or gold or any such matters?
I believe that there are the potential for offshore oil deposits, but they haven't been thoroughly explored. I think not drilling, on the mainland so much as what might be offshore, similar to what's in the North Sea. But again, the exploration to do that has been put on hold for at least 60 years.
Do other countries have artists and writers in residency programs? And at any given time, how many non-scientists, but artists and visual artists and writers are down there?
There's only 5 artists and writers that the National Science Foundation gives grants to every 2 years. So there's very few. I was the only one there for about 3 weeks, and then a writer joined me. So it's just, there's only 5 of us, and not all of us go at the same time. I think the year that I was given the grant, 3 of the other artists, one chose to go the following year, and the other 2 went to Palmer. So McMurdo is a much more harsh environment. As I said, we don't have any open water around there. It's really cold. You can't get there by boat. You have to get there by a Army cargo plane, and it lands on the ice, and there's a very short period of time where it can do that. So, but
the New
it's
Zealanders
pretty amazing.
The New Zealanders have a program, and the Australians have a program, and I think the British have a program. And I think people should understand that the reason for the program actually is very much about like what we're doing here. The idea is that science is this kind of encapsulated world that scientists talk to scientists, and a lot of the information exchange between scientists doesn't get out to the world, not due to any fault of the scientists. It's just people stay within their own areas of interest. And the idea behind the Artists and Writers program is in fact to disseminate science in another way. So I've actually been on the panel several times choosing who gets to go, which is interesting, being on the other side. And the idea is that it's very good because it's not literal. My work in some ways is very literal. I mean, my work, if you see it over there, it's very much about a journal. It's a kind of giant journal of being in Antarctica, what it's like being in Antarctica, the whole process from beginning to end. But there are other artists, because the panel does consist of artists, writers, scientists, and also educators, so that they try and pick people whose work will add in some way to understanding what Antarctica is like. And it can be, as I say, sort of literal like mine, or it can be much more ephemeral. There have been people who've gone and done sound projects. There have been people who've done theater. So it ranges, and it's a very tough process. I sometimes think, how did I manage to do that? But anyway, so it's very interesting to see. It's life-changing. Yep. So, but that is the idea behind it, and I've seen that actually there's been, every once in a while, somebody passes an email to me that somebody's screaming about, oh my God, we're spending taxes sending poets to Antarctica. I got that literally.
Oh, sure.
And I say, better sending a poet to Antarctica who can actually come back and say what is happening there, and letting people have an idea than other things which our government spends money on.
Exactly.
I'll say we're coming towards the end of our allotted time, so let's take 3 more questions, and then hopefully we can kind of mill around and maybe we can divide forces and have 5 times the efficiency in answering. And so 3 more, please, and if you don't get a chance to ask, please approach your target afterwards.
Okay. I have a question for anyone on the panel. Who of you is planning on going back to Antarctica, and what are your plans when you get there? What will your research and study be? Thank you.
I guess I'll start at this end. My project has a 5-month field season every year in the Antarctic, so we're in the Antarctic almost half the year. This year we had, I think, 14 or 15 graduate students and contract field biologists that I hired to go down to the Antarctic. So we plan to keep going as long as we can keep the money flowing to do so.
I think I said earlier that I was probably the person on this panel who's been least recently, and the answer to your question is, do I have a specific plan? No. Have I planned since the day I left to go back to Antarctica somehow? Yes.
I would love to go back. I don't think that NSF is going to give me another grant to go. But I'm thinking of going maybe at some point to Palmer, to that area. It's a totally different area than I was there. There is open water. It's a different terrain. There are different penguins. It might happen. And right now I'm trying to go to the North Pole. I'm trying to go the Arctic Ocean, which is much more difficult, but we'll see.
Even if I never get another chance to go to Antarctica, and I'm trying to kind of position myself, a colleague of mine just got a large grant to study some of the nototheniod or ice fishes in Antarctica, and he invited me. He's the person who got me on my first cruise, so I'm hoping that I can position myself to get on one. But even if not, I can sit there in my lab for the next 20 years or however long my professional life will go. I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of specimens just like this, for which I can only say, well, that's crustacean group A. But to put a name on it and say it is Exis Wyus, that is going to take basically the rest of my professional life. And I've just discovered a new species of something just right around Thanksgiving. And given the way that it takes sometimes science to make it, you get your discoveries into the literature, that probably won't even be published for like 3 or 4 years at best. So I'll continually working, at least from the standpoint of my lab, and just doddering along for the next 20 years.
Eric's not lying. I've seen those creatures in his lab.
There's always hope.
One can pray.
Can you give us an idea of the temperature range on the continent, please?
Well, you were saying you were there, it was 62 degrees, right? So that was on an island, is that right?
It has been as warm as something like 60 degrees. We were out there looking at emperor penguins and T-shirts. That is quite unusual. When I was living in Boston, it was warmer to go to the Antarctic Peninsula. And I would escape the Boston winter for the Antarctic summer, and that was actually a pretty good trade. So right on the Antarctic Peninsula, it's very marine influenced, and it hovers right around 32 degrees all the time. So a couple degrees this way or that way. It would get a bit colder at night, but really we don't get huge swings like you would in the middle of the U.S. It's not Minnesota cold by any means on the Antarctic Peninsula in the summer.
When I was there, I slept out at minus 62 degrees Fahrenheit, and this was their spring. So in the winter, it gets much colder. We had some really, and then the South Pole was minus 63. It was pretty incredible because it's not just the temperature. It's like I'm there to photograph. So I go out, and my goggles, they don't fog, they frost. So you have to go in, wait for your goggles to defrost, wipe them all off, run out again. It was pretty harsh conditions. And every day when you go into your cafeteria, there's the temperature, the wind chill, and what the real temperature is. It's extremely cold when I was there. The warmest day we had was like minus 10. And it was hardly needed a coat, minus 10.
Daniel, I would just, on behalf of the Board of Trustees, I just want to congratulate you and your staff for a really fabulous lecture series. And this is the museum, the Bruce Museum of Art and Science. And not only do we focus on each discipline, but we are always looking for the interface, and we have some very exciting things coming up. But I want to share with you just 1 second. We had a lecturer talking about some very exciting discoveries with dinosaurs from the Antarctic. And sitting in this room was very magical, not only with what he was telling us, and we're talking about discoveries in the last matter of months, but to be surrounded by your beautiful photographs. It was really magical. And I just want to thank all of you, but Daniel, great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. That was the best question. Thank you very, very much for the kind words, Bob. I'd like to say one announcement. We have one more event during the run of the Antarctic Photography Show, and that is Penguin Awareness Day. See, I get them mixed up. Penguin Awareness Day is January 20th. That's an evening event on a Tuesday evening, and we will be having a lecture on penguin evolution by myself, but also a live demonstration where we will 3D print the penguin that you see outside in the case at the entryway. And so we'll demonstrate some new technology. It's been a wonderful afternoon with all of you. I'd like to give our 5 wonderful panelists another round of applause for their time and expertise. I'd also like to make a second announcement. We have a few visuals here. We have some of those wonderful invertebrates in the cases back there. Diane Tuft's book is available at our gift shop right across the hall, and we have some of Elise's beautiful art here, so please take some time to take a close look. Thank you.